Hi, this is Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to our discussion of person-centered counseling. Now, this concept of person-centered counseling was developed largely by Carl Rogers, and this chapter focuses much on Rogers' approach to person-centered counseling. This is a part of the movement in the United States, which is called humanism, and on a broader scale in the United States, mainly California and New York, and mostly in the continental European world, what is known as existential psychology. So there is a little difference between existentialism, humanism, and certainly Carl Rogers' person-centered counseling. But what I would like you to just keep in mind is that these are related approaches. We're going to look at existentialism in the future. One of the big aspects of existentialism is finding purpose in one's life and the obligation or the once finding that calling, finding that purpose, the necessity of pursuing it, acting on one's own volition to become actualized, to live up to that potential. So we have ideas of purpose. We have also ideas of willful behavior, free will. In other words, the idea that we are free to respond to the biological pressures that we're born with. We are free to respond to the social, environmental factors that we are born into. But ultimately, in this person-centered counseling, the idea is cultivating a sense of purpose, a sense of finding worth, self-worth through purpose, and a sense of obligation of taking upon ourselves to actualize, to become who we are, as Friedrich Nietzsche put it, to become who we are. So you will be able to read the little introduction to Carl Rogers. I'm also including some interviews and also a classic clip from a program in which Carl Rogers gives therapy. We'll be seeing this same patient, Gloria, work with two other therapists in the future next time. Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt psychotherapy, and then finally in the future Albert Ellis, who is doing rational emotive behavioral therapy, a form of cognitive psychology. Unfortunately, you'll have to, well, I'm not sure it's unfortunate, but this is not a child example that you'll see in this classic video, but it is an example of the techniques used by Rogers, which he cultivated in his three major texts that you'll learn about in this chapter. So I'd like to kind of situate this historically for you, give you an idea of what this is all about. Psychoanalysis, the Freudian foundation, and that which came to follow Freud, was very much, in many ways, a deterministic endeavor. So for Freud, the idea was how drives, unconscious drives, determine our personality and how we act in the world. And on the other extreme, we have biological determinism. Behaviorism is another example of this. So humanism really arises in a time when there was a lot of determinism, a lot of idea of things being causally determined, like any lawful science is seeking to find cause and effect relationships. Humanism really arises outside of what eventually becomes cognitive psychology. So humanism predates the cognitive revolution, and it's really in reaction to this drive determinism of psychoanalysis. It was a reaction against this behavioral reward and punishment determinism of behaviorism. And today, humanism would be a reaction against this marionette idea that we are nothing but brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, and things of this nature. So the real focus of humanism is free will, the ability for someone to detach themselves from their biological urges, and the ability for an individual to detach themselves from their past and not feel obligated to react to every thought they have, every emotion they feel, every urge they have, etc. And this is really, in person-centered counseling, it's really about, humanism is really about cultivating and expanding free will. Now, interestingly enough, some of the psychoanalysts went in this direction. Maybe most obvious in the beginning were Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, and we're going to study Adlerian approaches in the future. But these were two who really focused on the ability to exercise action rather than reaction, a fundamental concept which is found in Eastern philosophy, in Taoism, Zen Buddhism. And this is, of course, greatly influencing Carl Jung. For Alfred Adler, understanding that we have some sort of willful choice to make in how we approach feelings of inferiority. We'll come to see this. These are all very similar concepts to what we find in humanism and existentialism in general. In existentialism, we're going to find that many of the psychoanalysts retained some of the most interesting aspects of psychoanalysis, such as the defense mechanisms and use of dream analysis, etc., but they changed their emphasis from the primary issue in human condition of dealing with sexuality, which Freud proposed, or spirituality is what Jung proposed, and instead they are interested in the idea of dealing with existence, what it means to be, is, what is it that we mean when we say is, and that angst, the fear, the anxiety that accompanies being and non-being, mortality. And you can tell this flavor is starting to get into a little more of intellectual deep waters, and you won't be finding this in Carl Rogers' person-centered counseling. What Carl Rogers is interested in is allowing the individual to become who they are on their own terms. The analogy that I find most useful for Rogers, very interesting, is the idea of a flower. If we take seeds and we put those seeds into nutrient-rich soil, and we plant those seeds, and maybe we keep them sheltered in the safe environment of a greenhouse where there's a constant warm temperature and protection from extreme trauma of wind and rain and hail, etc. These flowers are watered, and these seeds begin to sprout. Little green shoots come up, push through the soil, they become. And these, with proper nutrients and watering and care and conditions, they blossom and become what they are. The idea here is that when you plant apple seeds, you get apple trees. And these are the conditions that allow the flower to thrive, to become. Rogers takes the idea of becoming, which is central to existentialism and is also very central to humanism, and talks about human becoming rather than human being. Human being is the physical thing, but it's static, it's stable, it's something that you can analyze through a trait personality test or through laboratory science. It's treating a human being as an object, as a thing, as something else you'd study in classical mechanics, Newtonian cause and effect determinism. And for the humanists and Carl Rogers, this is an error. He said we can't study the human being as a physical object alone. We must treat human as human becoming, the human experience as human becoming, something that's constantly in revision, something that's constantly in change. Of course, now we have two aspects that are flying in the face of a deterministic idea that comes along with psychology being a science. This is why humanistic psychology does not view psychology as a natural science. It views psychology as a human science, part of the humanities. And you'll see that in humanism and in rational mode behavioral therapy, you won't see a lot of statistics, a lot of experiments. All this stuff is called into question. So that's interesting, but not so useful. When it comes down to what needs to be provided is a safe, caring, unconditional environment where the client can become who they are, can experiment with different aspects of their personality, explore their concept of person. That's the foundation of the counseling that Rogers is doing. What he tells us is that one of the concepts of coming into contact with the person, it's the foundation of this approach to counseling, is the idea of the sovereign human being. The person includes all components of the human being: thoughts, behaviors, feelings, the physical body. And that wholeness should not be reduced to a diagnosis or a label. The person develops and exists in a continually changing world of experience of which he is center. People are motivated by their inner directedness, progress to become more fully functioning, improving, becoming more independent, and enhancing themselves. So this is the idea that in humanism and in person, the person is becoming, and in becoming, it's not attaching itself to stagnant, safe, but yet stultifying conceptions of the self that people get locked into. It's becoming spontaneous, it's becoming flexible, it's becoming responsible to the world. And as your text tells us, the world is another central concept of child-centered counseling. It means everything the child or adult experiences internally as well as externally. Rogers used the word experience as a noun to refer to everything that is taking place within the person at a given time. The internal references contain the basis for looking at life. Whatever the child perceives to be happening makes up his reality. Counselors must understand the child's view of reality if they want to understand the child's behavior. Counselors look through the child's eyes. So we understand here that basic to person-centered counseling is the counselor's ability to cultivate empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is feeling sorry for. Empathy is the ability to experience the emotional experience of another person, to experience with them their joys, to experience with them their sorrows. And the only way to cultivate empathy is to, yes, certainly not through statistics and experiments, these measurable things, but empathy is cultivated through sensitivity, through opening the heart. These are very, opening the heart to others. Of course, these are very difficult terms for insurance companies and laboratory psychologists to get involved with. What does this mean, opening the heart? What does this mean, this sensitive empathy, seeing the world through the other's eyes? This is all very, very imprecise stuff according to the natural sciences and according to the folks who are doing natural science psychology in the laboratories and your research methods class. Instead of quantitative, this is qualitative research. The humanist, just like the psychoanalyst, sits down with the client, the patient, understands their world, and that is the research they do. When they write books, they write case studies, and not clinically removed case studies where someone is talking from a distance, but a phenomenological case study in which the therapist is an actively involved participant in the world. Now, there's another core concept that in humanism, and that's self. And that's parts of all of the child's experiences gradually form what the child considers the self. Self is the person's private world that becomes recognized as me across the interactions with others. Differentiation results in developing ideas about the self, about the external world, and about oneself in the world. Rogers defines self as the totality of the perceptions of the child. He explains that even infants have times in which they recognize, I am hungry, I don't like it, even though they have no words to match the experiences. Thus begins the natural process of the child's appreciating things seen as self-enhancing and devaluing experiences that are threatening or negatively impact the self. So we have three main concepts here: the person, the world, and the sense of self. Now, this idea of person, I'd like to talk with you about this. This is the idea that each human being is a person that in Marxist words, Marx was a humanist, a humanistic economist. In Marx's words, you treat another person as an ends in themselves, not as a means to some other end. So in other words, you don't use people. If you go somewhere and you're interested in getting to know the people that have something that you're going to benefit from, in other words, some affiliation with who they are, or their fame, or what they have that can benefit you, that's an inauthentic way of being with another person. The person is not a means to some end. The person is an end in themselves. So you meet and get to know another person simply because they're another person, just like you. And this is the idea of personhood. This is the idea that we each come into the world, and every child comes into the world and is of value within themselves, not in condition to what they have to offer someone else. And just like the little flower, the little seed that doesn't thrive if it isn't given enough warm sunlight, enough protection from harsh traumas, enough love and water and nutrients and rich soil, enough care, a person too will not blossom, will not bloom. They'll wither if not given what we call unconditional positive regard. And this is really the basis of person-centered counseling with Carl Rogers. Unconditional positive regard. The child comes into your office and they are treated as a full person, someone of great value, someone who has a right to be in the world and is as worthy as anyone else. And the way you achieve this is by giving a sense of unconditional positive regard. I like you for who you are. Now, this opens a question that people often have. Does this mean that anything goes? Does this mean that no matter what the person does, if the child kills animals and lights fires to things and is nasty and wrecks the room, does that mean that that's okay? No. Roger says there are boundaries that are set, and the child realizes and is taught that the counselor might not like everything or agree with everything the child does, and some actions may have consequences. However, fundamentally, the person is still respected as a worthy human being. Their worth in the world and their self-worth, which is reflected, which they gather from looking in their parents' eyes, is not called into question. Maybe a good way of illustrating this is if a parent says, "I love you, but I don't always like you." So, or when a child is doing something wrong, something dangerous, something that's imposing on others or putting themselves in danger, the parent makes clear that it's the behavior, the decision, the choice that has the consequences, but not the underlying value of the child themselves. Rogers found that many individuals grow up in an environment of conditional regard. I will love you if. I will love you when. Maybe one of the most blatant examples of this is in a very fundamentalist type upbringing, religious fundamentalism, where there's a very strict sense of the child is either respected or loved if they act as the parents feel is appropriate based on this external belief system. And the child comes into conflict with how they feel internally about things and how they feel they have to do to get their parents' acceptance and love. Now, this doesn't mean agreement. You can have, if you have parents who have certain worldviews, they can guide the child in accordance with those worldviews, but the moment that they withhold their love because the child is, or the patient is not in agreement with those worldviews, then that becomes conditional positive regard. It's what's really being conditioned here is the person's withholding love unless. I will love you if you believe how I believe. I will love you if you act the way I feel you should act. And that's quite different from teaching the child the benefits of that your perceived benefits of being in a certain way in the world, but still loving them regardless. And what happens when a child is raised this way, in this world of condition? The child doesn't develop an internal sense of themselves. They develop a constant sense of who must I be for others to accept me? Who must I be for others to love me? Who must I be for mom to love me? Who must I be for dad to love me, to want me? Who do I have to be worthy to others? And of course, this is a miscarriaged autonomy. This is not accepting an individual on their own terms. This is imposing ourselves on that other individual. And what we end up with is quite frequently an adult or adolescent or adult who has no real internal sense of self, but is lost to the outside world. They need some sort of outside structure to have any idea of who they should be at all. And for Rogers, the idea here is cultivating an authenticity, cultivating a sense of self that springs from within, not from without. So this means that you provide the child with a safe environment in which they can explore aspects of their selves, their behaviors, the way they act. And in so doing, and setting boundaries of things that are acceptable and unacceptable, but in so doing, allows the child to become who they are, to experiment with different aspects of who they potentially could be. This is particularly useful in adolescence. We know from our view of Erikson's psychosocial development that during adolescence, the big question is, who am I? And this is often confused by who must I be for the acceptance of others? Who must I be for others to love me? And what we call miscarriaged autonomy is when there's no sense of self that's developed from within. The individual clings on to what others want them to be. I think we all know people like this. You'll know this when you encounter people. In existentialism, we call this inauthenticity. People living inauthentically. They're kind of fallen. Existential analysis calls fallenness. Martin Heidegger called this a fallenness. This is when someone is lost in TikTok likes, lost in posting videos of themselves and base their self-worth on how much attention they get from being sexualized or being cerebral and smart, all this stuff, whatever gets them attention and acceptance from the outside, being affiliated with a certain name brand. I wear this kind of music, or Eric Fromm calls it automaton conformity, when one tries so hard to find a sense of self that they become some sports team, that their sense of worth rises and falls with the success or failures of the team, or some brand that they affiliate with. I think of some of the things I've witnessed over the years with the Kardashian brand. It's almost like cult-like how people try to emulate this and get a sense of self-worth through emulating some other that's largely based on inauthentic being. So authenticity is what we seek to find in the counseling session, and this is done by setting up a safe environment. One of Rogers' main texts, 1957, he wrote a classic article your textbook talks about, and it's about the necessary and sufficient conditions of the therapeutic change. What needs to be in place for change to take place? He addressed the question, is it possible to state in clearly definable and measurable terms what is needed to bring about personality change? Accepting the behaviorist challenge, Rogers proceeded to answer in descriptive terms. 6 core conditions for personality change have become the classic conditions for child-centered counseling. So these, in answer to the behaviorist demand that things had to be more systematic, more quantitative, more evidence-based, Rogers said this: here are the 6 core conditions for personality change. 2 people are in psychological contact, A degree of caring and investment in the relationship exists. The client is in a state of incongruence. The client may be vulnerable or anxious and thus motivated to change. So a client has to have some desire to change. Third, the therapist is congruent and involved in the relationship. The counselor is genuine, trusted, actualizing model is crucial to the effectiveness of counseling. So unlike the earliest forms of psychoanalysis, where the counselor is like a blank canvas that just listens, the humanist person-centered counselor is active, but active in an interesting way that I'll describe shortly. The therapist offers unconditional positive regard for the client. The counselor has an unqualified faith in the worth and dignity of the person. And that's, of course, different than the person's sense of self. That's the distinction between person and self. We might call it personhood. The therapist experiences empathic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference by expressing empathy and the implicit aspects of person's experience. The counselor creates a place in which the client can increase self-awareness, and the communication of empathic and positive regard is achieved. If clients feel valued by the counselor, they can value themselves more. Now let's see here. I have some slides. You can pause and read through these. It's just simply what's in your textbook. What I'd like to these are all things that we have covered. Okay, here we are. Here are the 6 ideas that Rogers proposes for what are the necessary conditions for a change to occur in the individual. So all 6 conditions are necessary for change. The 6th condition, the basis of trust between counselor and client, is especially vital. And later humanists named Thompson and Henderson maintain that the 6 conditions provide a sound foundation for most standard methods of counseling. So this is a very interesting idea. The rapport stage of counseling that we described earlier in this course. These are 6 conditions that are useful regardless of any type of therapeutic method that you're using. Humanism is really great with children. This person-centered therapy. Person-centered therapy is very effective with many adults and particularly effective with older aged individuals, people in the golden years of their life, the winter of their life, as Jung would put it. Humanism can be very difficult when dealing with, well, firstly, individuals who don't have great ability for insight. So, in other words, individuals with mental retardation or any type of cognitive deficits. And also, humanism seems to be not very effective with addictions. However, addictions counseling. However, there are other methods that are much more useful with addictions, such as Gestalt therapy that we're going to discuss next. But the thing that can be used is these six qualities for change can be used in the rapport building portion of therapy. That's the first sessions where you're building a relationship with a client. If you come on too strong and start attacking and from the very beginning, attacking, I mean attacking change things, then this shuts people down. But building the rapport through this empathy is very much part of any therapeutic setting. So these are very useful. So let's look at some other ideas here. So how do you go about setting this environment in the therapy session? Well, in addition of unconditional positive regard, in addition to having a setting that's very nurturing, a very inviting office area for children, it might involve soft plush carpet that they can play on, or chairs that fit them, their size. An environment maybe has toys, a very positive environment. It involves a very caring disposition of the counselor. So what we see here is, as is stated in this slide that we're looking at, in humanistic person-centered counseling, the therapist does not just listen, but the therapist also does not give advice. They don't even ask questions or offer any type of interpretations. Really, what the counselor offers is, simply put, empathy. The therapeutic method, the counseling method, is really about providing the patient with a sense that they are being heard, they are being understood. And according to Rogers, the magic, the healing takes place once an individual feels that they are understood. And once they feel they're understood and heard and still loved, still appreciated as a person fundamentally, they begin to blossom. They begin to build the strength to become who they are. And then, of course, that has to eventually be kind of fortified in the life outside of the counseling session. So when they go back to their homes, where they might have criticism from an overly critical parent, or they might have bullying or criticism from classmates, etc., or others, like teachers, building an ability to be resilient against the conditions of others and remaining true to oneself being the key to contentedness in life. How does one set forth these sense of empathy? And we talk about this as active listening. And incidentally, not only do these techniques I'm about to describe not only do they have great value in counseling, they also have great value in everyday relationships with our family and friends, people we're talking with. These are just great ways of being a good communicator. I have someone I know who I occasionally bump into, and they could really benefit from some of these ideas, because they are one of those individuals who dump on you. They're not so interested in what's going on with you. They're interested in dumping everything that's going on with them onto you. And it's interesting when you actively cultivate the ability to listen to others, how we suddenly find that we have less to say and more to hear, so to speak. So here are some of those ideas of active listening process. So the first is paraphrasing. So the child says something to you. I don't like the way Derek told me that I was stinky and ugly and no one wanted to be my friend. And then you paraphrase back to the small child. It felt bad to be spoken to that way. Or it feels bad when others say nasty things to us. So that's like paraphrasing back to the child, not your interpretation, but the message that they're here, but that they're sending you. And this is a sort of clarification. This clarifies for the child, A, that you're hearing them, you're listening to them. They say, yeah, that's it exactly. And it's also helping them to process what they're feeling. The act of being understood, the act of describing, and the act of hearing our description returned to us through a paraphrase or through active listening, it can be very clarifying, not unlike when we journal, write out our thoughts and how they become clear once we've written them out. Another active listening strategy is summarizing. So they tell you how there's something going on. You say, so let me get this straight. Derek is being nasty to you, saying things that are very unkind, such as that you're stinky and no one wants to be your friend, and this is making you feel bad. So that's summarizing. Again, it helps the child to organize their thoughts and feelings and their experience. Reflect the feelings. You're saying back to the child, it feels bad when someone says nasty things to us. This is simply not adding really anything, just clarifying, which is really the next idea here. Clarifying is, again, let me get this straight. Am I hearing you correctly? Are you telling me, am I getting this right? These are all ideas of active listening. And the idea is that by doing this, by providing the child or the adult, but by giving the child a sense of being heard, being understood, and it allows them the ability to clarify and to organize their thoughts and feelings into a way of grasping their experience. I'd like to turn now to Roger's 6 principles. Which come from, I'm trying to remember where this comes from exactly. Yeah, I'm finding the reference. I'm not finding the reference here. But let's describe these from the slides. The first principle: I have found that it does not help in the long run to act as though I am something I'm not. So, in other words, in the words of Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, don't be a phony. Be authentic. Be real. How are you authentic? By being who you are, discovering who you are, not being someone who is going to get likes or approval or attention from others. Second principle: I have found it effective to be accepting of myself. There's this. You can use affirmations in this way. Try this. Get up when you wake up in the morning. Before you get up and do your things, close your eyes and 20 times repeat to yourself, I am okay just as I am. I am okay just as I am. Just repeat this mantra and really think about it. Say it 15, 20 times and see how this affects how you feel about yourself. So it's useful to accept who you are. I'm okay. Even though I'm not perfect, even though I'm not good enough, I'm still okay enough. The third principle: I found it to be of enormous value when I can permit myself to understand an individual. So, empathy. The only way to Oh, it's such a difficult thing, is to stop judging. As a matter of fact, many of these things that we learn in humanism come from Buddhism. And the first, in Buddhist psychology, the first lesson is stop judging yourself, stop judging others. And that doesn't mean observing and realizing that there are better choices, some better choices than others, but that's different than judging. Judging is moralistic. You're not good. I'm not good. I'm better. You're worse. That's judging. But observing is there. That's an approach, and it has consequences that can be avoided with this approach. There's a difference between observing and judging, and this idea is it's central to empathy, I believe. Found it to be a value to open to the realities of life as they are revealed to me and in other people. In other words, don't try to control everything. Be open to see what happens. In Taoism, this is called non-interference. You see what happens. Stop living in the illusion that you control everything that happens in life. Be receptive. Again, lots of the concepts of humanism come from Eastern philosophy, which came through the philosophers such as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and then later Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre, a reaction to Martin Heidegger. These were all Western thinkers, European thinkers, who studied Eastern thought and then kind of turned that into Western, what we call today, existential humanism. The fifth principle: the more I am able to understand myself and others, the more I am open to the realities of life, and the less I find myself wishing to rush in, wishing to control everything. And sixth principle: it has been my experience that people have a basically positive direction. This is a central Rogerian concept, which I think makes things distinctly different from existentialism in a whole. Existentialism, this question remains open about people having a positive direction. That's not assumed. But in Rogerian, it's a little more cozy. It's a little more fluffy. The idea that individuals often, at the basis, want a positive, have something positive to express. They have a flower to blossom. Now, when we get to existentialism, we're going to see that this is not a given, that we have even a choice here of whether or not to be a lamb or a wolf. We have a choice to a certain degree how to react and to certain things, and sometimes that's not so pretty as we see everyday life. So this idea of has been my experience that people have a basically positive direction is a very, very a concept that's very characteristic of Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy and the idea of unconditional positive regard. These are all in your textbook. Little examples here of things to watch out for. You've heard these responses probably from adults in your life that just shut down the conversation. You have a conversation, you tell someone something, say, oh, don't worry about that. We all have problems worse than that. And that's called a discounting feeling. Again, in any therapeutic practice, you don't do that. I think you have a problem, listen to this. If you think you have a problem, listen to this. In other words, it's discounting what the person has to tell you. You must have done something to cause that. Oh, what did you do that caused that person to act this way? These are all discounting. Giving advice. Rogers is against giving advice. Instead, he's about reflecting and clarifying the person's own thoughts and giving them a safe environment to think for themselves. So any type of advice is not part of person-centered therapy. Summarize the problem. You feel blank because of this. You are sad because your best friend moved. You are happy because your team won. Now, this is summarizing the problem. This is helpful in clarifying. And first, counselors ask themselves whether the client is expressing pain or pleasure. So this is building empathy, understanding what the person's going through. Then find the correct feeling or word to describe the emotion. And don't parrot the exact words of the client, but capture the feelings to help them recognize their emotions as indicators of their direction in life. You feel blank because blank, and you want blank. Again, this is all summarizing all these different methods, all these things that we described earlier. Okay, yeah, let's take a look at the play therapy. So, applying all this to children. Counselors provide warm and caring environment. You know this. Children can explore their emotions and consequences of their actions. They can evaluate alternatives and select one to try. With young children, counselors may have to assume a more active role. So this comes into a question, of course, of with adolescents. So when you're starting to deal with older kids, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20s, you can, they don't, you can be less directive. But with little kids, I think there's a structure that I think that the counselor needs to be have a little more to offer in the guidance area. In other words, maybe a little more willing to explore through asking questions. Of course, this isn't Rogerian adult therapy, but child therapy. Seems to me that you have to assume a little more of an active role. So in play therapy, for example, and I offered a link on the canvas to a classic text in Rogerian child play therapy. You can get this little paperback book for a song. It's very, very inexpensive. Debs and this clinical experience with a small child becoming who they are. The counselor has a genuine interest in the child and builds a warm, caring relationship. The counselor accepts the child unconditionally, not wishing the child were different. And the counselor institutes a feeling of safety and permissiveness in the relationship, allowing the child freedom to explore and express. The counselor maintains sensitivity to the child's feelings and reflects them in a way it's increasing child self-understanding. So, in other words, the child, the therapist, the counselor is looking and observing and bringing to the attention things that they're seeing in the child. And that helps the child to process that for themselves. The counselor trusts the inner direction of the child. This is very Taoist, allowing the child to lead the relationship and refusing to override the child's decision. So there are some boundaries that have to be set. If the child's being destructive or being mean to others, to the disrespectful, then the counselor or the therapist has to set boundaries and be honest about this. However, on a general way, the child leads. It's very much like Montessori education. If you've studied Maria Montessori's methods of education, feel very similar to this. The counselor does not hurry the process, so this is on the child's timeline, not on the counselor or the insurance company's timeline. And the counselor uses only the limits necessary for helping the child accept personal appropriate responsibility. This is the boundary setting area for this. I want to conclude by telling you the three classic texts by Rogers. That's 1939, The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, 1942, Counseling and Psychotherapy, and 1961, On Becoming a Person. That's a very On Becoming a Person is a very, very important book from 1961. On Becoming a Person, Client-Centered Therapy, and I'd say 1942, Counseling and Psychotherapy. So 42, 51, and 61. Like every 10 years he came out with a book. And these are really the central ideas of Rogerian person-centered counseling. Again, we have low technique, certainly not the complicated things that we encounter when we're dealing with psychoanalysis, but yeah, very effective for children, very effective for adolescents, very effective for the elderly as well, geriatric psychotherapy.